Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining us today. On behalf of the Environmental Finance Center Network, welcome to our session today on what is the Clean Water State Revolving Loan Program and why should I care? My name is Tess Clark from the Syracuse University Environmental Finance Center. As a reminder, this is one of a monthly series that we're doing to talk about the CWSRF and how local communities can make the most of it. And in a moment, I'll be turning things over to Heather Himmelberger, Director at Southwest Environmental Finance Center. But first, there are a few logistics for me to cover. So first, everyone will be kept on mute to ensure audio quality. If you have a question, just type it into the GoToWebinar question dialog box at any time. We will be sending out a follow-up email that includes a link to the recording for today's session. Additionally, please look at the GoToWebinar control panel in the handout section where you can download a copy of today's presentation for yourself, as well as a few other resources. Okay, and on that note, I'll hand things over to Heather. Take it away, Heather.
Thank you, Tess, and welcome everybody. And I'm glad you can be, glad you can be here today. And as Tess said, I am Heather Himmelberger. I'm the director of the Southwest Environmental Finance Center. And there is a whole network of environmental finance centers. Some of us are at universities and others at nonprofit organizations. And we were set up to really look at innovative ways to solve the difficult how to pay issues of environmental protection and infrastructure. So the State Revolving Fund, how it works and how it helps utilities get their environmental infrastructure and protect the environment and public health is a really big part of our mission of trying to help everybody come up with where's the money, how can I build what I need, or how can I run what I need, those types of things. On this project, we don't have every single member of the Environmental Finance Center network, but we have several members. So you see on the screen there the 6 universities that are part of this project. And then we have 2 additional partners who aren't technically EFCs, but they're helping us out. So we have Moonshot Missions, and they're trusted peer-to-peer advisors and work directly with communities on water and wastewater issues and how to address those in small communities. And then the Mississippi State University Water Resources Research Institute. And they do a lot of work with on-lot and decentralized wastewater systems, which is why we're happy to have them as partners, because that is part of this whole project, is not just the centralized world that is mostly what we're talking about today, but there's also a decentralized world who might be using septic tanks and other means of wastewater treatment. And there is funding under the Clean Water State Revolving Fund for those kinds of projects as well. Today's webinar is the first of a series. This will be taking place over the next year. So our plan is to have one a month, and with the exception of December, it will take place on the 3rd Thursday of the month. So you can see the dates on the screen and the general topics that we plan on covering, and it'll be a logical progression through the Clean Water State Revolving Fund process with, again, one per month. And we did change the December one because it was a little bit too close to Christmas to have it on that Thursday. So we did change that one date. Otherwise, it's the 3rd Thursday of the month. Every webinar will be an hour. So we're just taking bite-sized chunks of the Clean Water State Revolving Fund each month, and and today we'll kick it off by sort of just an overview of what the Clean Water State Revolving Fund is. So the intent is that these are a series, and we would hope you could attend them all, but we understand you're busy, things will come up. So we welcome you to attend any and all trainings that you can, But if you miss one, you can always review the recording of any training. So we are recording these trainings, and you're happy, we're happy to have you look at the recordings and all of that sort of thing. You can also share any of these recordings with others on your staff. So if you're on one of the webinars and you think, hey, it'd be great if my finance person heard this part, or my city clerk or my city manager, whoever, from your community you think would benefit, you can always have them come live to one or watch a recording. So again, it is intended for a series, but you can pick and choose the topics, and then you can always watch the recorded webinars to get any information that you miss. So with that introduction, we will start talking about the Clean Water State Revolving Fund and really get into what is it and why should you care. And we have a couple of poll questions just to get us started. So Tess, if you want to run those polls, we can have you tell us a little bit about your experience and knowledge of the SRF. So we're asking you to answer the question, what is your general knowledge of the State Revolving Fund program? Are you completely new to this? Are you beginner, moderate, experienced, or very experienced? So if you could just take a moment, click on the best description, your best guess at where you fall on the spectrum so we can kind of get a feel for our audience today, that would be great.
Fantastic. It looks like we have almost everyone participating, so we're going to keep this open just for another few seconds. I'm going to close the poll in 3, 2, last chance, and 1.
Okay,
and then quickly, I can share the results of this one, Heather, first.
Perfect, yes.
Okay. All right, so you should be seeing the results of the poll. Looks like most people said that they're a beginner, but there's a very even spread between completely new, beginner, and moderate. You're all within about 10% of each other. That's exciting.
Yeah, that's great. That's kind of what we were hoping, because this is geared more for that beginner stage. So I think that's going to work out very well. And then the next poll question.
Yep, we're next asking you to tell us, have you ever received CWSRF funding? So you can say yes, no, or if you're not sure if your community or your municipality's already done this or you're new, just say not sure.
And this is like at any point. So this could have been 10 years ago, 20 years ago. At any point, have you ever received Clean Water State Revolving Fund monies, just to get a feel for how many of you have actually used the program.
Excellent. Looks like we're almost there. So I'm going to give you just another 3 seconds or so to respond. So I'm closing the poll in 3, 2, last chance, 1. And here are our results. Resoundingly, a lot of folks have not used the CWSRF before.
And that's actually good for us, because that is one of the reasons that we're here today, is to try to help you access that funding. So if all of you had used it, maybe this wouldn't be as useful. So I think it's good that we have a lot of people who haven't, and hopefully through the course of this year, we can get your comfort level with the State Revolving Fund up so that you would be willing to use that funding in the future if you have an infrastructure project or a non-point source project that might need funded. So we had a webinar, a kickoff webinar. Some of you may have participated in that webinar, some of you may not have. The webinar was just intended to kind of introduce this whole 12-month process of the SRF. And we asked everybody during that webinar to give us a word or a short phrase that they thought of when they thought of SRF. So if they heard SRF, Clean Water SRF, what popped into their head? And then we created a word cloud out of those results. And the bigger the word is in a word phrase, the more times somebody put that into the chat. So if you look at the big words on the screen, you can see grants, you can see money, you can see loans, you can see complex, you can see cumbersome, you can see confusing, complicated but essential, hoops to jump through. So there's a lot of negative words in there, and I think that's fairly common when I've talked to systems about the SRF. What often comes to mind is, oh my gosh, that's too hard, it's too complicated, it's too confusing, there's too much you have to do, there's lots of requirements. So many of the words that you see on the screen there is what pops into people's minds. So what we hope to do through this series is maybe change the words that come to mind when you think of it, and maybe have a bit more positive feeling. Yeah, there are things that you have to do to get the money, but there's also a lot of help to get you through the process. One of those helps is this webinar series, but we'll talk about it later. There's also a lot of other kinds of help and direct technical assistance type help that can be brought to bear to help get you through. And again, hopefully get you in a little more positive frame of mind when you hear SRF. So let's start with why there's an SRF to begin with. Why did EPA ever go down this road at all? So we might, keep in mind, and we're actually going to come back to this theme a little bit later, that wastewater infrastructure costs a lot of money. So you have pipes in the ground, you could have pumps, you might have a lagoon, or you might have a wastewater treatment plant. There's a lot of things that you have to do, and it costs a lot of money. Anytime you're digging under the ground, and wastewater is going to be deeper than water in many cases. You're trying to collect water from a home, you want it to flow by gravity, so you're digging a deep trench and putting a pipe under the ground. So you might have to rip up a roadway or a sidewalk. All of that costs a lot of money, and that's been true since the very beginning of time. Once we started piping wastewater in communities, it was very expensive. So EPA in 1972, let me back up one step. In 1972, Congress passed the Clean Water Act, which was kind of the first really major piece of environmental legislation, and it was specifically meant to deal with pollution in our surface waters that was coming from non-point source and point source, wastewater treatment plants. So again, if we're going to improve those things, we need money. So EPA created what they called the Construction Grants Program, and as the name implies, grants means a lot of that money was given away for free, and very little of it was loans. It started to change over time because guess what? It's not sustainable. If you're just going to take a bunch of money and give it out, as much as every system out there, every community out there would love that to be the case, because it's way nicer if you don't have to pay back money. The problem is it's not sustainable. There's not enough money in the budget to keep it going at a strictly grant program. So in 1987, there was an amendment to the Clean Water Act, and they created a revolving loan fund so they could have a sustainable source of funding. So that's when the state revolving fund idea was born. It was kind of born out of this idea that we can't sustain 100% grant to communities all over the country. We have to have a way to bring the money in a more revolving way, in a more sustainable way. So again, it started with the Clean Water Act amendments of 1987, and it has been modified over the years, and we're not going to talk about each of the modifications other than to tell you that as Congress passes various laws, which you'll see, it's usually an alphabet soup, like the Water Resources Development Act and that kind of thing. The most recent one is the IIJA, or the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, which we also know more commonly as the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. And I made that one bigger because that is a huge change in the amount of money that's available, and it did change some of the requirements as well. So in 2021, we have that IIJA, which really made a big impact on the Clean Water State Revolving Fund, again, both in money and some of the requirements. The other acts had various tweaks to the Clean Water State Revolving Fund and have changed it a bit over time. There are 51 programs. There is a program in every state, and then there's also a program in Puerto Rico, which is where we get the 51 programs. And just a bit about the Clean Water State Revolving Fund by the numbers. There has been $153.6 billion of funding through 2021. So this is a little bit old, but so there's been a few more billion since then. And there's been 44,555 loan agreements through 2021. So that is a lot of communities who have received money. Some of these would be multiple loans to the same entity, so it wouldn't represent 44,000-ish separate communities, but it does show that there's quite a bit of money and loan agreements that have taken place since the start of the State Revolving Fund program, the Clean Water State Revolving Fund program. I should mention there's also a drinking water program. We're not talking about that today. Some aspects of the two programs are the same, some aspects are quite different, so we don't want to mix and match them. So we're only talking about the Clean Water State Revolving Fund today. So small communities have received $34.8 billion in funding, and about 30,100 loan agreements were for small communities. There are way more small communities, community wastewater systems than large communities, but large communities serve more people. So it gets a bit confusing because you figure your larger cities are serving a lot of customers. So there's fewer of them, but they're serving tons of people. And small communities, there's a lot more of them, but they're serving fewer people. So you see the reduction in funding compared to large communities, where that was 153, total, only 34 billion for small communities. And that's because, again, they're going to be smaller entities, need less money, but the loan agreements, it's 30,000 out of the 44,000. So you can see more agreements made, but a little bit less money. And I will mention that the BIL new law that passed is very much aiming to increase the amount of money and loan agreements that go to small communities. So it's a big emphasis on trying to reach underserved communities who maybe traditionally haven't gotten money from the SRF. So this is from the EPA website. It says the Clean Water State Revolving Fund Program is a federal-state partnership that provides communities low-cost financing for a wide range of water quality infrastructure projects. So we want to take a look at the three things that I've highlighted in red: the fact that it's a federal-state partnership, the fact that it's low-cost financing, and then that it does a wide range of infrastructure and water quality type projects. So we'll start with the federal-state partnership idea. So EPA gets the money from Congress. So Congress, appropriates money to EPA and says you have X billions of dollars to spend on the SRF this year. EPA goes through its formula to figure out how much money goes to each state and to Puerto Rico. And there's a complicated, formula that was set up in 1987. I believe it hasn't been changed since then. Although the drinking water one has changed, I believe the wastewater one hasn't, but they're looking at it now to see if maybe that will need to be changed in the future. So EPA will take the money they get allocated, send it via grants to each of the states. So the states will apply to EPA and say, okay, we want our allocated funds, whatever that might be. So maybe that's $10 million. We'll go ask EPA for $10 million. The states have to match it. Generally, the match has been 20%. It has changed a bit under BIL because there's so much extra money. There has been some changes to how much match has to occur now, but in the past, it's been a 20% match. So then the fund is bigger because the state has to match by 20%. And then the EPA also provides direct grant funding to Washington, D.C., and the the 4 territories, Virgin Islands, American Samoa, Guam, and Mariana Islands. There's also some tribal set-aside money that's administered by EPA, and that is direct grants to tribes. So those are not loans or grants. They are competitive, so the tribes need to apply for the money. And typically, in most regions, EPA works with Indian Health Service to get that money out to the Native American communities. So again, there's this tribal set-aside that's also taken off the top. So in addition to the grants and the direct funding, there's the tribal set-aside monies. So the 51 Clean Water State Revolving programs function sort of like an infrastructure bank by providing low-interest loans for projects. So there'll be a loan agreement that's made, and we'll talk a little bit about how this disbursement is done in a little bit later. But essentially, the recipient is repaying the loan. So that money goes back into the overall fund. So now we have more money to loan out because we're getting new money every year from EPA. We're matching that 20%, and we're also getting the money back that the recipient repays. And then new loans happen, new recipients get the money, and they start repaying. So that's the revolving aspect of the state revolving fund, and why it's called a revolving fund is that the funds will grow over time as we're infusing more money through, EPA money, through the repayment money. And there's also other ways states can grow that through bonding. There's different ways that they can use bond monies to also grow the funds. So And some of the states will actually put money towards infrastructure and that kind of thing. So there's lots of ways to get money into the fund and keep it revolving. So the money will grow in those funds over time and again, make it more sustainable. One thing to keep in mind is we are trying to give money out at reduced interest rates. So it would grow much faster if it was a true bank sort of situation where a bank is trying to make money by charging you a high interest rate if you loan money out, and you have to pay back, say, at 3% or 4% or something like that. The SRF program would have it maybe be 0% or 0.5% or 1%. So it's not going to grow quite as much as it could, but it is still growing over time. And now we want to talk about the F word. And it is not the F word you might be thinking of, but the F word in State Revolving Fund is flexibility. And this is a huge, huge part of the State Revolving Fund, that the states have a lot of flexibility within broad guidelines. There's a lot of flexibility of how a state might want to run their program, what they want it to look like, how they define disadvantage. There's all kinds of things that a state can do. So when you look across the 51 programs, they're not going to look identical. There may be a few elements, similar from state to state, but there's going to be a lot of differences as well, because the states are going to be using their flexibility to try to help their constituents, their wastewater systems in the best way possible. So that's something to really keep in mind, is we can't talk a lot of specifics about an individual program, because any program we picked would be different from state to state, and we can't go through all 51 programs. So we're going to talk more broadly about the types of things they can do, but understanding within your state, there is a lot of flexibility on how they're going to actually administer the program. So they can do various types of assistance. The things that we think of the most are like loans, just direct loaning out money to a system who will then use it for an environmental project and then repay the money. They can also do refinancing, so an existing debt, they could refinance that. They can do purchasing of debt. They can do guaranteeing local debt and purchasing bond insurance. They can set the specific loan terms, including interest rates from 0% up to market rate. They can have payment periods up to 30 years, and that 30-year change was relatively recent. It started out at 20 years, but because many of these projects are very long-lived projects and it's hard to pay back, they expanded the payment period to 30 years. So states have a lot of flexibility, again, to target financial resources to specific communities, customize loan terms, provide financial assistance through additional subsidies. So they can do grants, principal forgiveness, and negative interest rate loans. Typically what is done is principal forgiveness, which means that if you took out $1 million loan and you got principal forgiveness of $100,000, say, then you would pay back $900,000 instead of $1 million. So it's just a way of sort of getting you to the same place as a grant, but there are differences in how grants, principal forgiveness, and negative interest rate loans are administered, and the principal forgiveness is the easiest way to do additional subsidies. So most states use that approach as opposed to grants or negative interest. So negative interest would be like charging you minus 2% interest. So like each month your loan amount is going down. A lot more complicated to administer. And then finally, they can target green infrastructure, water and energy efficiency improvements, and other environmental innovative activities through the Green Project Reserve. So again, every state is going to have a different mix of how much of these things they're doing, what they're emphasizing in a given year, or how they incentivize you to do certain things. So very, very different from state to state. So in low-cost financing, this is a big reason we have the SRF, because it will give you low-cost financing. The average interest rate in 2020 was 1%. The market rate that year was 2.7%. Right now, states are really reducing their interest rates. So some states are at or near 0% for most of their loans. So it is a really good time to borrow money. And below market rate interest saves lots of money over time. So if you look at what you would have to pay if you're paying the market rate versus what you pay at a really low interest rate, there's quite a bit of money that you're saving by having these low interest rates. And again, there's additional subsidy possible that works like a grant. So as a reminder, those grants, principal forgiveness, and negative interest rate loans can greatly reduce what you have to pay back. And that has increased under BIL, where there are incentives and requirements for states to give away more of their SRF in the form of additional subsidy. So when we get to water quality infrastructure projects, what kinds of projects can you do under the Clean Water SRF? There's lots of things. You can construct municipal wastewater facilities. You can control non-point sources of pollution. You can build decentralized wastewater treatment systems, create green infrastructure projects, protect estuaries, and fund other water quality projects. And actually, there is source water protection money within the Clean Water SRF, which doesn't exist in the Safe Drinking Water SRF, which is a little odd nuance of how things come through Congress and whatever, but so there is that kind of money as well. So the Clean Water SRF has eligibilities for lots of different kinds of entities, communities, private entities, nonprofits, citizen groups, although again, it does vary by state. And they do, EPA's, this is from EPA's website, they say for every $1 from the federal investment, $3 has gone to help communities. So I think it's a really good return on their investment. So as you invest money in wastewater infrastructure, it really helps that community quite a bit. So how does it work? What kinds of assistance?
Heather, can I interrupt before you move into the next few slides? So we had a question that's timely, and I think it's good to just address now. So the question is, are the interest rates affected by inflation?
And the answer to that is essentially no. It is up to the state to decide how they want to set an interest rate. And once you set that interest rate for your loan, it stays. So if you get a loan, let's say a 30-year loan at 0.5% interest, which I think is what New Mexico is, about 0.5% for like any borrower, and 0 if you're a disadvantaged borrower. If you get 0.5% interest, that is going to be the life of your loan. So it wouldn't matter if inflation went up or down, your loan is at 0.5%. And they don't set those interest rates based on inflation. They're set on a whole host of other things. So you're in pretty good shape. Once you're locked in at that interest rate, that's what it's going to be for the life of your project. Any other questions, Dawn?
Not right now, thank you.
Okay, great. So again, types, we've talked about some of this, assistance, the types of things they can do, and we're not going to go into tons of detail about all of these things, but just know that there's lots of ways you can go. We'll talk through a little bit of these types of things that it can do, and know that some of these are more just internal to the state program and how it runs, and doesn't really affect the borrower, at the community side. But they can do loans. The terms of the loan may not exceed 30 years or the useful life of the project. And what they mean by the useful life of the project is different assets will last different amounts of time. So if you have a pipeline, that's going to last a whole lot longer than, say, a treatment unit. So a pipeline might be a 100-year type useful life, where a treatment unit might be 30 years. Something else might be shorter than that if you're doing like a laboratory building or something like that. So what they want you to do is not have the loan term be longer than how long the project's going to last. So if you're building something that's 20 years and you would take a loan for 30 years, that's not going to make a lot of sense for you, because you'll pay for 10 years after that facility is already gone, and that will be really hard for you. And the interest rates must be at or below market rate. So this fund is not to be making money off of you. The community's debt can be purchased by the SRF. So there are programs if you already have debt. There are restrictions. It's not like a completely simple thing, but you know, if you have debt that you want to refinance, this may be a possibility with the Clean Water SRF. They can do guarantees and insurance where this type of assistance results in improved credit access. So if communities can get better market rates, there's a whole process to allow that to happen. They can issue debt guaranteed by Clean Water SRF funds to increase the amount of money in the program. They can provide loan guarantees, and there are programs where, like, if a municipal type entity wants to have, say, a decentralized program where that would be hard for the SRF to provide borrowers, like homeowner type borrowers, direct monies, they can go through an intermediary and give the intermediary the money, and then the intermediary gives that money, you know, loans that money out to the community. So there's different ways they can do that kind of thing. We've talked about the subsidies already. There are a little bit of restrictions on, you know, who you're giving the subsidies to. Now let's get into the disbursement process. So this is where the borrower is asking for money. Let's say you're going to build a $1 million project. It has some pipeline, has a new treatment plant. You're going to incur the cost of construction, and then you're going to send a reimbursement request to the SRF. So the SRF is not going to directly pay your construction contractor. You're going to get the money from them to pay your contractor. So you're going to be the one to actually deal directly with the contractor, not the SRF program. And then the borrower at the end, like once you've done your whole $1 million loan, you've paid it all out, you've paid your construction contractor, you're all done, you have some time, like say around a year generally, to start repaying the loan. So after you've been completely reimbursed, all your, you know, your money is done, then you start repaying the loan like the next year. So it is a little bit of a process. There is information available on the state contacts for each system or for each state. If you want to know who in your area would be a good contact to talk to, there are links provided. And Dawn, maybe you can put the links in the chat for people to access. And we also have funding tables by state. So in the Environmental Finance Center Network website, we have funding tables by state. And if you click on a state, like in this case, I just clicked on New York, you will find these funding tables, and it has all the funding sources. So there's actually 10 pages of New York funding sources. And you can see this is the first page, and on the first page, the first page appears a Clean Water State Revolving Fund. It has a link, it has a little description, it has a contact person. So you can also use our funding tables to find the contact person for your state. Another resource that we have, or a couple other resources, is EPA has the Clean Water State Revolving Fund fact sheets, and those are information about the funds. And then we have what we call our SRF Info Hub. The SRF Info Hub contains information about the 51 programs on water and 51 programs on wastewater. So if you click on a state, so in this case I clicked on Iowa, you can click on whatever state you want to get the relevant documents, and what will pop up is a little description of, you know, who is running the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund, who is running the Clean Water State Revolving Fund, their logos, a link to their site, and then a list of documents. So the legislation, the intended use plan, project priority list, annual report, loan ranking criteria for both drinking water and clean water. And it tells the dates that we were able to find that stuff. Not everything is updated every year. So for example, the state legislation that allows them to have a fund is not going to change very often. So if there are changes that are made in law at the federal level, the state may have to adapt that language, and then the legislation would change. Otherwise, the legislation is going to kind of stay the same. Project priority ranking criteria or loan ranking criteria is sometimes set for quite a while and doesn't change annually. So you'll see it vary, like what date the information is from. And then you can click on the link. Again, this is just another way to access the state's SRF program. You can click on the link to get to the state program website and get the information you need. So what can I use my Clean Water State Revolving Fund monies for? We are going to go in depth into this topic in the workshop on May 18th. So we're not going to spend, again, a lot of time talking about this today because we're going to really dig into all the different ways that you would be able to use your Clean Water Revolving Fund monies. Generally, on the wastewater facility side, it's construction for new and rehabilitated assets. And then there's also non-point source projects that you can use money for, and there's lots of opportunities there as well on that side of things. And here, this is from EPA's website, which shows kind of a list of their typical types of programs that you can use, you know, that have been funded by the Clean Water. And again, we're going to go in gory detail on a future webinar, so we're not going to talk about it much more today. So what doesn't the SRF fund? The big thing that it does not fund is operation and maintenance. So operation and maintenance is this day-to-day stuff that you do, like I have to go out and turn on a pump, I have to go out and clean a probe, I have to rake off the debris that's come into the pump station on the manual bar screen. So it's not going to fund that kind of thing. Where I think we need to look at pushing the boundaries a bit is there's in between construction of new facilities and day-to-day operation and maintenance. There are other things that fit that sort of spectrum, and looking at maybe pushing the boundaries a little bit of what can be funded. So condition assessment activities, perhaps, things like that. So condition assessment of pipelines that maybe reduce the amount of pipeline you have to replace. We can look at potentially those kinds of ways to use the funds. So why should I care about the SRF? So we're going to wait just 1 minute before we run the poll, and I'll just show this slide first. So wastewater infrastructure is expensive. So we're going to put a poll up just on this vein of wastewater is expensive, and this is the one on the pipeline cost. So Tessa, if you want to open that poll.
Yep, so right now you should be seeing a poll, and what we're asking you to do is let us know what is the per mile price you paid the last time you replaced a pipe, and guess if you don't know.
Yeah, your best guess is good enough. This is just sort of a exercise just to see what people are paying for pipeline, and it has gone up quite a bit, and I've been hearing that getting metallic pipe is becoming really difficult. Long lead times, costs going up. So I think if I would have asked this question before COVID, it'd be a very different answer than post-COVID, you know, as costs are starting to skyrocket.
Yeah, so folks, I know you're thinking about this a little bit, so we'll give you a few more seconds to sort of think it over. And again, guessing is okay. And I imagine some of you may not be totally confident guessing if you're not representing a community. So we will just leave this open for another 3 seconds, and I'll close the poll in 3, 2, and 1. All right. And here are the results. So resoundingly, 51% of people said $379 per foot. And then there's another 28% of folks that said $190 per foot.
Great. So, you know, let's say even at the lower end, we have some people who are up at the higher ends, the $3, $4, and $5 million per mile end. And we had some, you know, at the lower end of 1 to 2 million. That's still a lot of money. So if you had 10 miles of pipe in your system, you're talking about $20 million, or, you know, for the at the $2 million per mile price. So we're talking about a lot of money. Even at the low end of the spectrum, we're talking about quite a bit of money. All right, you can go ahead and close that. So here's just an example. This is from a real utility. We're not going to say who the utility is, but this particular utility had, we got some costs from them of the types of things that they're putting in. There's an overall project cost of $64 million for a community that's a couple thousand people. So again, it gets really expensive to replace. And if we're not doing incremental investment in our facilities, we're going to have a lot of money that we need. And where are we going to get that money from? And that's where the SRF really comes into play, is there is a lot of money that can be loaned out. And with the new bipartisan infrastructure law, there's an additional $12.7 billion over 5 years. And one of our webinars will really go into the BIL funding, what has changed, what money is coming into the fund. So we're going to get a lot more into the BIL world of things at a later webinar. But essentially, we're talking about a lot of money, and you'll probably find it very, very hard to pay for things out of just your own funds. And the focus of BIL is really helping small, disadvantaged, underserved communities seek the funding. It's not exclusively for those communities, but that is a real emphasis of the funding to help those communities get into the program. And again, like when you think about how you're going to pay for this pipe, that you were saying is $1 million, $2 million, $3 million, $4 million, $5 million a mile, or treatment plants, or whatever it is you need, would your rates really cover that? Do you have enough money coming in from your general revenues to be able to do that? And for most communities, the answer is probably no. And have you been incrementally funding? Have you been putting in replacement dollars every year to try to avoid a big spike in the amount of money you need? Most communities are not. When we last looked at this issue with EPA, probably about a year or so before COVID hit, so maybe about 4 or 5 years ago, the level of an incremental investment was at about a 200-year replacement cycle, which means we are only investing about 0.5% of what the total value of the facility was. So at that level, you have to have your assets last 200 years. I mean, that isn't going to happen. Most assets, no way are going to last 200 years. You're going to be able to stretch some of them to the 100, maybe 120, 125 range. But most of your assets are not going to make it that long. So we're definitely underfunding. And so again, if we're underfunding, we're going to need influxes of money. And so, if you have to do major projects, the SRF is really designed for that. It's designed to give you that cash infusion that you need, where you can't do it on your own, but you could go to somebody else who does. And you can think of it as similar to if you were buying a house, how many of us would actually be able to write the check, say for $200,000 for my new house, I have cash sitting there for $200,000. Most of us who are not in the wealthiest end of the spectrum can't just write a check in cash to pay for our house. We need to borrow the money from a bank. So we go to a bank, get that infusion of money, and then we pay it back over time. It's the same kind of idea for water and wastewater. Is if we don't have that money, we have to go somewhere. If we went to a bank, it would cost us a whole lot more money to get that, because it's going to be at a higher interest rate, shorter terms, that kind of thing. So the SRF is really meant to help you with those big cash infusions when you have big projects you have to do. There is free assistance available to help you throughout the process. So you're not alone. There are lots of resources. So we have resources now, and the EPA just put out monies to 29 environmental finance centers across the country. So they are there to help in lots of different ways with funding specifically. We also have ability to help through the various programs that are already in place at our EFC. So we will try to, be available to answer any questions that arise from the sessions that we're holding today. If you have a question, put it in the box. You can ask us in between sessions. You could ask us a question at the next session if you want to go back to something we talked about. So there's lots and lots of ways. We have free, and I want to emphasize free, no cost to you technical assistance available, and that can be provided remotely or in person. And that can be on a funding project, you know, to work your way through an SRF loan, or it can be on any number of technical, managerial, financial topics. So you see a whole bunch of topics on the screen. There are other topics that are available, so this is not in any way all exhaustive. And again, it is free as long as your community is less than 1 million gallons per day treated capacity. Or permitted capacity, which is roughly a 10,000 person community if you're looking at population. Or if you have a decentralized system, you can also receive services. And if anybody is on the water side here today, 10,000 population and less is how we address the water side. And we do have money if you're a drinking water system as well. So one way to get help is to go to the Environmental Finance Center Network website, click the Get Help button. And there's just a very little tiny bit of information you have to fill in for us to be able to reach out to you and give you help. So we now have a poll question related to that. So Tess, if you want to run that poll question, I don't think we need to show results of that. We just need to open the poll.
Sounds good. So here you can just let us know if you'd be interested in working with the EFCN one-on-one for assistance in any area. So go ahead and you can respond.
I was going to say, it's just another way, instead of having to go to the Get Help function, you can just reach out directly and we'll try to get in touch with you. So just let us know if you'd be interested in free TA. And while we're waiting for that, I'll just mention that there are some links in the chat box to some of the resources that we put out there today, just so you're aware of that.
And I've gone ahead and closed the poll there. So we'll take a look at who responded and get in touch if needed.
Okay, so just some wrap up, you know, hopefully some other words have now come to mind about the SRF other than what we talked about at the beginning. Hopefully you're thinking more in lines of, you know, this could be really helpful to me. This could be a good way for me to fund a project. It could save me some money. Yes, there is complexity and we will be talking about it, but the point is we have help to get you through that part of it. So there's lots of help in various ways to get you through the harder parts of it. So, you know, really keep in mind that this could be a good way to fund a project if you need one, if you're having environmental public health concerns that you need to address, if you have, you know, decaying infrastructure that you really need to replace, the SRF may be what you're looking for. And again, just wanted to bring this slide back up on the screen. We plan on taking this very step-by-step and talking about different aspects of the Clean Water Act in each webinar. So next webinar, we're really going to dig into the changes to the state revolving fund that occurred with the additional BIL money. So talking about the money itself, and then some of the things that were put in place with the BIL. You know, there were some other changes, and then we're going to go through various other aspects, how to apply, the documents you need, what happens after you submit your application, those types of things throughout the year. And again, it'll be a 1-hour webinar, third Thursday of every month, except in December. And we welcome your participation throughout the whole series, or as many as you can attend. So with that, we're going to open it up to questions, and I'm actually going to move on to the final slide while we have it open for questions, just because we have contact information from our program on the screen. We're going to have 3 different EFCs providing some of these webinars. So our center, the Southwest Environmental Finance Center, will be doing several of these webinars, but we will also have the University of North Carolina Environmental Finance Center doing a couple of those, and then the Wichita State University Center is doing a webinar. So I put the contact information for all 3 groups on the screen, and you're welcome to reach out to any of us in between times if you have questions or comments or anything like that. Even if you have a comment like, we hope you'll cover this topic, you know, feel free to reach out to us with something like that. And if we could fit that into one of our webinars or tell you which webinar it's included in, we're happy to do that. So with that, I will ask Dawn if there's any questions that have come in the question box, and you can feel free to type in the question, any question you have in the question box, and we will try to answer as many as we can.
We do have some good questions. So one is asking for clarification. Can we refinance specifically here a New Mexico Finance Authority loan as part of an SRF application?
So say that again, refinance a New Mexico Finance Authority loan?
Yes.
The answer is maybe. I don't want to say yes or no, because there are some conditions that have to be met in order for the SRF to refinance a loan. And we would be happy to work with you to find out if your loan would be eligible. So if you can reach out to us, or Dawn, I don't know if you have the contact information for that person, but we're happy to work with you to see if your loan can be refinanced. Many can, but there are certain conditions that have to be met in order for it to take place. So possibly would be my answer. I don't want to say yes or no without knowing more details, but it's definitely worth considering if you could get better terms and that type of thing. It's definitely worth looking at. We had one community we could have, with a refinancing, could save them quite a bit of money. And we're looking into whether or not that could be done because it will shorten the term and reduce the interest rate. So it would save them a ton of money over time. So it's definitely worth looking into, and we're happy to dig into that more with you.
All right, and then another clarification on the TA. Is it population of 10,000 for the municipality, or that many people served by the PWS?
So in the case of wastewater, it's actually the wastewater treatment capacity. So what you're treating now, so you may have a NPDES permit, a National Pollution Discharge Elimination System permit, for say 2 million gallons, which would be above, wait a second, let me finish that. For $2 million, but you are 2 million gallons a day, but you're only processing 750,000 gallons. That would comply. You may have a permit that's 1 million gallons a day or less. Any of those comply. So it's really on the wastewater side, it's permitted or treated capacity. So it really doesn't matter how many people you have in the community. It's just that roughly equates at 100 gallons per person per day. 1 million gallons treated roughly equates to 10,000. So we would really be looking at your treated capacity, like how much wastewater is going into your treatment system. If you don't have a discharge, it's just what is the amount of wastewater going into your facility. So like some lagoons are zero discharge. So they're evaporating the water, they're not discharging anything. So in that case, you may not have a permit. But then we would want to know, like, okay, 500,000 gallons a day is going into your lagoon on average. Okay, that would qualify. So if you have any questions about it, you can reach out and we can work with you on that. But in the wastewater side, it actually is the treated capacity at the treatment plant, or if you're decentralized, decentralized qualifies. And the water side, the drinking water side, it's 10,000 people or less. So they do it a little differently on the water side versus the drinking water side. And I hope, Dawn, do you think I clarified that enough?
I think on the drinking water side, just to clarify a bit, the 10,000 is the number of people that are served by the PWS. So, all right, next question is, what about crossover with the drinking water SRF when dealing with something like a drinking water reservoir?
So typically a project is either a clean water SRF project or a drinking water SRF project. And so you're going to look and see which one of the funds is more likely to be able to fund the project that you have. So reservoirs are kind of a tricky one because they're mostly excluded. In the original language of the 1996 amendments to the Safe Drinking Water Act, they were completely excluded, and now it's changed a bit. But reservoirs are a bit tough. Like a raw water reservoir is a bit of a sticky issue on how states are handling whether you can fund that kind of project or not. Other projects like the source water protection issue that I mentioned, is a bit odd. We would think of drinking water source protection as belonging in the Safe Drinking Water Act, but it actually is in the Clean Water Act. So you might have a project where you're funding some components of your drinking water system under a Safe Drinking Water Act loan, and then you wanted to do some source water protection type stuff, and you're funding that under a Clean Water SRF loan. They wouldn't intermingle those. You would get loans from each of those, and that would fund your whole project, and you would abide by drinking water SRF criteria to do your drinking water part and clean water SRF criteria to do your clean water part. So your whole project could be funded by 2 different funds, but you'll follow each fund's rules to do the part that, you know, they're going to pay. So again, it has to do with what's eligible under which funding. And you can even not mingle, but have co-funding from different agencies. You can have the Rural Development pay part and the Safe Drinking Water Act pay part, and then you abide by the rules of each of those programs for the part that they fund.
All right, and then a question about New Mexico SRF program. Are principal forgiveness loans available in the state of New Mexico?
Yes. So New Mexico is actually doing quite a bit of additional subsidy. So yes, there is additional subsidy for disadvantaged communities based on how the state defines disadvantaged community. So it is definitely worth looking at because there's quite a bit of money in New Mexico for disadvantaged communities. There's a lot of money throughout the country, but I know New Mexico in particular has quite a bit of disadvantaged community monies that, you know, will reduce the principal. Again, most states are using that principal forgiveness as the way to do additional subsidy rather than a grant or a negative interest rate. And just about every state, I believe, under BIL will have to have principal forgiveness in some way, shape, or form for certain communities. So each state can define how that looks, you know, what communities can get it, how they're going to give it out, you know, and, you know, again, getting back to that flexibility idea. But yes, there are, for disadvantaged communities, there will be lots of opportunities for principal forgiveness. And that does not mean like completely free. In most cases, that is not going to be the case, but it would be like part of the loan would be forgiven. So maybe like you get 25% forgiven and 75% is loan, you know, something like that. So typically they're going to be some portion of loan. Again, state by state might be different, but they're, you know, what that portion is, but typically those principal forgiveness would be part of it as principal forgiveness and part of it as a loan. Any other questions?
Follow-on question is, what's the process to apply for principal forgiveness? So we're about out of time. So the question came from Paul. So Paul, maybe we can get in touch with you in a follow-up meeting to kind of help walk through some of the steps and contacts and whatnot.
And basically the short answer to that question is it's part of the whole, it's just the application process. And then when you're eligible for principal forgiveness, that will be worked out during the application process. So we will talk about the application process in future webinars. We can definitely follow up with Paul now, but for others who are online, we will talk about that application process, what that looks like in, I'm trying to remember which, which date that is, but we will have July 20th webinar and August 17th and September 21. So basically those 3 webinars will really get into that whole application process. We'll talk about things like what documents you need, how to prove that you're eligible for principal forgiveness, and that type of thing. So stay tuned to those mid-range, mid-year webinars, and we'll definitely get more into the whole application process. Okay, it looks like we're about at time. I really want to respect everybody's time and keep these to 1 hour. So I really appreciate everybody signing on today. We appreciate you being here. We will be recording these webinars and making the recordings available. So you will get a chance if you missed anything or you want anybody else to listen, you can watch the recording after, after we post it, which give us a couple of days to get it up there. And then they'll be available for you. So again, thanks everybody. Really appreciate you being on today.
Thanks everyone.